I submit to you that getting international trade policy right is fundamental to conservatism. You might think that this is an overstatement, and I suppose you could be forgiven for thinking that if you were to look at the trade policy of self-proclaimed conservatives over the last 3 decades. Back in 2003 or 2013, international trade simply did not figure in a lot of our discussions about conservatism. And where it was a topic of discussion, it consisted of virtue signaling comments about promoting economic freedom and exporting market economics to China, India, and other countries. Indeed, when George W. Bush was running for president, he proclaimed his broad agreement with President Clinton on totally liberalized trade, particularly with China. Then candidate Bush was effusive, saying, quote, "The case for trade is not just monetary, but moral. Not just a matter of commerce, but a matter of conviction. Economic freedom creates habits of liberty, and habits of liberty create expectations of democracy. I believe that trade serves the deepest interests of our country and advances the hopes of the Chinese people for a freer society. Our greatest export is not food or movies or even airplanes. Our greatest export is freedom. The people of China stand ready to receive it." Now, we could be tempted to say in retrospect that this sentiment was quaint, but in reality it was very damaging to our country and to the conservative cause. So-called free trade has not brought democracy to China or anywhere else, nor has it led to peace. I would say that Bush's hubris in attempting to bring democracy to Iraq was matched only by his expectation of bringing market economics to China. Both were quixotic misadventures that were incredibly harmful to our country, economy, and culture. And I can say this as someone who both served in Iraq and have to deal with China every day. As it turns out, George Bush's alignment with Bill Clinton on free trade was actually an anomaly when it comes to the conservative movement. Throughout American history, the usual conservative position was clear. The 1992 presidential election is known, of course, for Ross Perot's insurgent campaign, which rightly focused on preventing the debacle that became NAFTA. President Reagan, of course, often praised trade, but his pragmatism prevailed when he imposed tariffs and threatened to impose tariffs on Japanese imports. President Nixon is famous for imposing a global tariff of 10% because increasing imports were preventing us from keeping enough hard currency in the country. And Teddy Roosevelt made his views on international trade very clear, commenting in 1895 as follows, "Thank God I am not a free trader. In this country, pernicious indulgence in the doctrine of free trade seems inevitably to produce fatty degeneration of the moral fiber." As Teddy Roosevelt described, an over-reliance on so-called free trade undermines production and creates a debtor society. It's a layaway program using our children's inheritance as the payment. And there's nothing conservative about that at all. I'll talk in more detail about the history of the conservative movement and international trade policy, but I wanted to set up this contrast at the beginning. The goals of trade policy should not simply be to make the most trade deals or drive efficiency at all costs. It should be to support American workers and their families, ultimately to support a conservative society. As conservatives, it's been drilled into us to always lament that politics is downstream from culture, but I would say that even culture itself can often be downstream from economics and the systems that it sets up. So if we want a conservative culture, we have to create a conservative economic system. So I would say that what we need to do is create a production economy. So what do I mean when I say a production economy? A production economy is one that's oriented around production rather than consumption as an end in itself. This kind of economy emphasizes a large middle class that makes and grows rather than a small elite that extracts, reallocates, and squanders. America became great. There we go, some claps, that's good. America became great because for most of our history, we had a production economy. In the beginning, the founders, they debated this vigorously, what the economic order of the new nation should be. They knew that just like they had carefully crafted our system of government to promote our values and safeguard our liberties, it was also important to set out the contours of the domestic economic system, which would do the same. So this, of course, required careful attention to international trade, and it's actually addressed in the Constitution. The Constitution set out authority for the new government to, quote, regulate commerce with foreign nations, close quote. In other words, liberal international trade was not the default setting. The founders knew that other nations should not automatically benefit from free access to our market. The debates between Thomas Jefferson's nation of farmers and Alexander Hamilton's nation of manufacturers actually resulted in a practical compromise. We would be both. Whether through toil on the land or labor in the factory, we would be a nation of producers. And even in their commitment to the yeoman farmer in his fields, the Jeffersonians recognized the need for industrial might to maintain our independence. And although he valued work on the land above all else, Thomas Jefferson warned against industrial dependence on foreign powers in the lead up to what became the War of 1812, which laid those vulnerabilities bare. Of course, the Hamiltonians agreed. Alexander Hamilton had argued that America needed tariffs and industrial policy to promote manufacturing and allow our young country to develop without being subject to the coercive economic policy of the British Empire. Eventually, this view was perfected by Henry Clay, and his unique model was called the American system. It combined tariffs and state support for industry with the belief in the power of a large internal free market. And we guarded access to that market very carefully, particularly because other countries were not party to our country's social contract, the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution is our most important free trade agreement. We believe in free trade in the United States, in our nation, within our social contract. Countries outside the United States don't benefit from that. Why should they, by default, have free access to our market, absent significant concessions? Henry Clay saw how European powers were flooding American shores with cheap goods created by armies of exploited workers with inputs extracted from abused colonies. As these imports crushed our young factories, Clay reminded the country that the object of wise governments should be to protect the industry of their own citizens against the policy of foreign powers, as to give it the most expansive force in the production of wealth. Thankfully, America took this advice for most of its history and became a production economy par excellence. By World War II, Bethlehem Steel and its subsidiaries were able to produce more steel than the Axis powers combined. Could we do that now, is a question we should ask, with that or any other important commodity or input. And in fact, as recently as the 1980s, our leaders understood the need for America to produce. A young Donald Trump warned of deindustrialization, taking out a full-page ad in the New York Times to decry how Japan and other nations have been taking advantage of the United States and demanding that the government take action to end our trade deficits, which are much larger now than they were in the 80s. President Reagan, of course, took action. He imposed quotas on imports of Japanese cars. He put tariffs on foreign steel and other products, and he used the threat of even larger tariffs to convince the world to join the Plaza Accord to realign distorted exchange rates that were distorting global trade. So it's no surprise that the libertarian Cato Institute in 1988 called Reagan the most protectionist president since Herbert Hoover. But the aggressive intervention worked. Japanese automakers moved their operations to the United States, creating more than 100,000 new American jobs at more than 300 new production facilities within a decade. And that continues today. Some of these Japanese automakers are the largest employers in the US. Our trade deficits went down, and the erosion of our industrial base began to reverse at that time. And so across this long duration of time, America grew at a breakneck pace and emerged with breathtaking prosperity. Thankfully for the world, right? America's safe when we have a strong industrial base, but the rest of the world is even safer. However, there's always a however, right? So here we are. Between the early 1990s and 2016, our leaders, including those that considered themselves or set themselves up as conservatives, they forgot, either willfully or negligently, they forgot the lessons of our past. They abandoned a production economy and pursued what I think of as a debtor economy instead. Why? To curry favor with big business and our trading partners. Often, when you look at motivations of policymakers, they want the Europeans to say something nice about them. They want to go to an international meeting and be lauded for their foresight and globalist thinking. And unfortunately, that is the motivation behind a lot of this. And of course, just making money off the backs of American workers or workers in other countries. But in any event, these leaders made a series of decisions that unwound the delicate balance of what really has historically been a conservative society. We signed away our sovereignty by opening our borders to unprecedented and nearly unlimited flows of foreign labor, as we just heard from Tom Homan, foreign capital, foreign goods, and foreign services. We voluntarily dismantled our defenses and outsourced the rules of trade to a system overseen by a World Trade Organization in Switzerland. U.S. trade policy was essentially implemented on autopilot by Washington bureaucrats to comply with directives from unelected judges in Geneva. I mean, it sounds crazy because it is crazy. Establishment politicians and policymakers did not consider how this radical opening and global hyper-integration would affect American workers, families, and communities. They did not remember the words of President McKinley, who said, "Free trade will bring widespread discontent. It will revolutionize values." And that's what we've seen, and that's why we've seen workers, labor unions, swing states, the industrial belt become more conservative, or at least remember their conservative roots. People like President Clinton promised that if we opened our market, then all the nations of the world would follow. They assumed that when we took down our trade barriers, other countries would reciprocate, they'd buy a surge of American exports, and we were told that in the process, the rest of the world would become more like us, everyone would become a free market democracy, we'd all hold hands, we'd sing, be really incredible. Of course, this didn't happen. Neoliberalism did not make the world embrace free market economics, just like neoconservatism did not bring democracy to Iraq or Afghanistan. Instead of exporting our way out of a trade deficit, we sank deeper into that hole as we borrowed more and more money to finance our consumption of stuff other people were making. And so during that process, we lost 5 million manufacturing jobs, over 60,000 factories, as cheap goods flooded our markets from countries like China, who were completely misaligned with our own goals. But we did not shift to making more valuable goods like we were supposed to, according to economists, who told us there would be creative destruction and we'd move up the value chain, et cetera. The reality is the communities that are the lifeblood of our conservative society did not switch from making steel to making semiconductors, unfortunately. In far too many cases, they went from being vibrant hubs of production, manufacturing ecosystems, to concentrations of welfare, poverty, and even despair. The foreign opening just did not happen at all. Some countries reduced some tariffs, to be sure, but even in those cases, those countries usually switched to using non-tariff barriers to block U.S. products and accumulate trade surpluses, all of this at the expense of regular Americans and the working class. These other countries crafted regulations that made it nearly impossible for American goods to enter their market. They conditioned sales in their countries on American companies moving production, IP, and know-how there, and then they manipulated their currency to gain an unfair advantage to export back to the United States. But they also doubled down on precisely the things that made their societies so much different than ours. Americans had fought for high wages and labor rights that allowed them to support their families and buy the products they were making. Americans had rallied to preserve their environment so their children could hunt and preserve forests and swim in pristine lakes and streams. Employers had to find a way to make an honest buck without dumping poisons or abusing their workers. And in exchange, those workers helped them build innovative products that were sold in countless thriving communities across the country. This was part of the unwritten compact that allowed us to have a conservative society and allow the working class continued mobility. But other countries chose to play by different rules. Their workers were desperate and exploited, and their environment was choked with refuse. If you go out into the Pacific Ocean right now, there's something called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch floating in the middle of the ocean that is made up of plastic and trash flowing into the sea from Asian rivers. Companies operating in places like that could naturally make things cheaper than companies that had to play by our rules. Now, I'm not here to advocate, extensive, regulation, et cetera, but obviously there's kind of, basic expectations, and these other countries have they've used an arbitrage to exploit their own environments and workers to undermine our companies and our workers. But this arbitrage was repackaged by the various serious people at our universities and media as a natural comparative advantage and lifting people out of poverty. But whatever happened, one by one, our factories shut down under the weight of this so-called competition. Now, even though all of our policymakers were making all of the wrong decisions, the truly conservative position continued to be championed, even though it wasn't embraced in Washington. Pat Buchanan, Ross Perot, obviously familiar names, they warned about the excesses of free trade. A young deputy U.S. trade representative named Bob Lighthizer left the Reagan administration and spent the 1990s as a voice in the wilderness warning against China, the WTO, and the outsourcing of American productive capacity. He, of course, later became the United States Trade Representative in President Trump's first term and helped execute President Trump's vision of transitioning back to a production economy. Now, even though employment in America, after the Great Financial Crisis, generally rebounded by the 2010s, including in the regions that had been hit by this import surge from China, the new jobs were primarily in low-wage service work. And the people taking the new jobs were not the ones who had lost the old jobs. So when you hear people say that, well, trade just, it moved labor around and they had better jobs, that is not the case. The good jobs left, bad jobs filled up, and it went to different people. And this isn't just polemics. I'm not just talking about this because I'm grumpy. There are data. There are credible studies showing all of this by people who don't agree with me on my politics. And here's what the data show. Native-born black and white workers without a college education experienced permanent employment declines during this period. Those workers in Michigan, they did not leave to find better jobs elsewhere or become a home health nurse in Tucson, Arizona, like everyone said they should. Instead, wanting to, of course, to stay home with their families and live in the communities where they were raised, economically, they got stuck. They fell out of the workforce, and far too often they became depressed, they became sick, they turned to fentanyl, etc. Our disability rolls swelled, and once prosperous communities got poorer, more precarious, and less stable. We went from being a nation of producers for decades, if not centuries, to a country of debtors. Our government borrowed to fund ever and growing entitlement spending and welfare, and people loaded up on debt in their personal life to keep their lifestyles as wages decoupled from productivity and economic growth. And foreigners, of course, were happy to extend the credit, borrow money, or send money to the U.S. through our bonds, etc. And America, what did we start doing? We specialized in allocating capital for a fee rather than generating capital, and we financed our own decline. Like Esau in the book of Genesis, we traded our birthright and its long-term promise for the instant gratification of a mess of pottage. And fueled by welfare and foreign credit, the show went on. And there were a lot of people making a lot of money, but in the meantime, our society continued to erode. The heartland became a rust belt. The streets, less safe. Our divides seemed to get sharper, and as we all know very well, people reverted into tribes, essentially, of identity. They latched onto ever thinner slices of that identity to define themselves. And the stock market went up, it always goes up, right? And large multinational corporations reached greater profits, and the richest Americans became even better off. Sometimes we talk about the trade deficit, and people say, Jamieson, why do you worry about that? Does it really matter? It's just an accounting identity, etc. The reality is, large companies ignore trade deficits because they make money on both sides of the border. Of course they don't care about it. But for normal people who work, the trade deficit is manifested as factories moving from Wisconsin to Mexico or Asia. The trade deficit is something someone in Asia is making that could have been made here by a worker. Indeed, the rest of America, as this happened, felt itself sliding into some kind of a permanent sense of loss that we could never have a production economy again. And so I can understand why a lot of young people feel concerned about this and worry about their future and decide to put off marriage and family and all these different things when we have divisive ideologies and a lot of things stemming precisely from this decision to have a fully liberal trade position. It's not hard to see why these divisive ideologies specializing in victimization could really take off in this kind of culture. So, I've complained a lot. I've been like serious, negative Nelly up here. But the real question is, how do we change course? How do we take our country back? How do we encourage a production economy that can sustain American greatness? And how does trade policy play into that? Well, we've already started this project. The first term of President Trump, we changed trade policy. We started with China. The Biden people, whatever we think about them, they didn't really touch much of that. They let that continue, and now we're in a position to double down. The reality is, we have to, it's easy just to say tariffs, that tariffs are the answer. Tariffs certainly play a key role, right? And as the president says, they're one of his favorite words. But just saying one word on the subject is not really the full story. I want to talk about three more words in the context of trade policy, and this is sovereignty, solidarity, and balance. Some words you may not associate with trade policy, but let me just talk about them. So first, sovereignty. None of what we're talking about right now in terms of changing our trade policy is possible without our sovereignty. How can we have a conservative economy, conservative culture, or conservative politics if we don't have a sovereign country that controls its own destiny? Sovereignty, as we know, it's really a mix, right? It's a mix of autonomy and resilience and all these different things that allows us to stand on our own 2 feet. Autonomy protects our unique system of government. In America, it's the people that decide the great issues. It's not foreign powers, it's not international bureaucrats. And this includes having an autonomous trade policy, and our trade policy must put America first. This probably sounds common sense to you, but the reality is, starting in the early 90s and up until 2016, we did not have an autonomous trade policy. And the reality is we had a Washington consensus that considered it blasphemy to consider making trade policy here in the US versus running it through Geneva. For years, the appellate body, which is a judicial body at the World Trade Organization, would nullify every American attempt to protect its workers and guard against the rise of China. And over multiple decades, foreign interests and their US allies have undermined America's efforts to ensure our goods are treated fairly. For example, some jurisdictions have heavy value-added taxes, like the European Union. They rebate them for exports. Over the years, the US has tried to approximate that through legislation. It's not even partisan, right? Republicans, Democrats. Every time America has tried to do it, the WTO has overruled it. We should be furious about this kind of thing. How could the most powerful country in the history of the world meekly accept an arrangement where the people making and growing things in America get fewer benefits than the people making and growing them abroad? So in the first term, President Trump shut down the appellate body at the WTO, and now we have that organization right where we want it. Sovereignty also, in addition to meaning autonomy, means resilience. A country that relies on adversaries for all of its medicine, semiconductors, automobiles, and critical minerals can't be said to be fully independent. You may have seen news lately about China restricting the flow of rare earth magnets from China to the rest of the world and inhibiting our factories from operating. Now, I would love to only blame the Chinese for this, but guess what? In the 1990s, well, first of all, we invented that technology, the rare earth magnets. And then in the 1990s, we had a company in America called MagnaQuench that made the magnets. And around 1995, the Chinese expressed interest in buying this company, and the US government said, okay, you can buy it, but you have to keep the factory open in the US for at least 5 years. You know how this story goes. On the first day of the 6th year, that factory essentially was shut down and sent back to China, and now they've restricted that. But of course, because we believe in production economy in the Trump administration, we've purchased a stake in MP Materials Mountain Pass Mine. We've talked with the private sector about getting rare earths up and running again. We invented the technology and we have it, but this is the kind of thing that we cannot allow to happen again. Let me talk a little bit too about solidarity. While sovereignty gives us policy space, that allows us to really promote a national solidarity and the kind of unity of purpose and really being a nation. As a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, I know how sovereignty and solidarity go hand in hand. Pressured and persecuted, the early church was built on a combination of faith in God and the virtues of self-reliance. And I have some great quotes here because there are a lot of people in Utah who really love free trade, so I got some good stuff to push back on them. To protect themselves in the early days in Utah, Brigham Young encouraged every one of the Latter-day Saints, male and female, to decree in their hearts that they will buy of nobody else but their own faithful brethren, who will do good with the money they will thus obtain. Later on, he wrote to a guy named General Thomas Kane. This was 1869. He was not a member of the church, but he was a guy out east who was a supporter. And Young made the following point to him regarding the international trade debate of the day. Quote, "Eastern senators need fear no opposition from us to a protective tariff. On the contrary, it is one of the very measures we would most desire. The development of home industry is of the first importance, whether to the Commonwealth at large or to this territory, and every measure that will protect it from foreign competition demands our hearty support." So at least in Utah, this philosophy manifested itself in local cooperatives and textile mills. And today, of course, members of the church are known for strong families and commitment to community. But the point is, an atomized nation, it can't endure very long. People of all religions, races, creeds, etc., need to appreciate again that we're one people in one nation working together to prove the benefits of self-government. And I want to be clear, trade is not good or bad, right? I'm not up here to be kind of make a religious point that trade is evil and we should do away with it, we have total autarky. That is not the point. Trade is just a means to an end, not an end of itself. So instead of setting a policy and saying, well, we'll just see where it leads us and the chips will land where they may and it's a suicide pact, we'll just take free trade into the sunset even if it destroys our communities, we need to decide what kind of economy we want, i.e. a production economy, and then set the trade policy that makes sense. And that's going to change over the years. It will be different. I mean, listen, if we're ever in a situation where we have massive surpluses, come back and talk to me and we'll talk about tariffs and their applicability. But that's not the situation we're in. So we need to have a strong hawkish trade policy right now. Our current economic model really pits producers against consumers. A country where the benefit of the buyer comes at the expense of the worker. I mean, this kind of situation, everything degrades. This is why George Washington made a point to wear an American-made suit at his inauguration. It's why we use Buy America laws to try to steward taxpayer dollars. It's why people are upset when I tell them that nearly all the American flags they see waving in our streets are actually, you guessed it, made in China. In Abraham Lincoln's view, public policy needed to promote a harmony of interests where increased manufacturing productivity led to rising wages and improved outcomes for all Americans. It's not really any coincidence that Lincoln both banished slavery and demanded tariffs in almost the same breath. Lastly, I'll touch on balance, and then I'll finish up, because I know people only listen for the first 10 minutes anyway, so I'll wrap it up. The roots of a conservative economy, a production economy, are found in the notion of balance. America consumes a lot. In fact, our disproportionate consumption power relative to the rest of the world is something that makes our economy resilient, and it gives us tremendous leverage in trade negotiations. Now, our weakness is not consumption per se. I'm not against consumption, but the fact that so much of what we consume is produced abroad, things that could be produced here. The result is that every year, well, at least in 2024, we essentially gave $1.2 trillion back to trading partners in the form of our trade deficit. Now, a lot of those dollars come back, but they often come back as speculation and debt or the acquisition of U.S. assets. You have these folks with surpluses, they export here, they get hard U.S. currency. What are they going to do? They don't give it to their consumers. They don't stoke domestic demand in their countries. They often don't even invest in their own countries. They come here, they buy our assets. That's what they do. They buy American assets. And so we essentially are selling our children's stake in the future of our economy for cheap stuff and executive paydays. And this addiction to imports, it contributes to the indebtedness of our country, and it's not sustainable. And this is why President Trump has taken action both to reduce government spending and impose tariffs and made deals to tackle the national emergency caused by our enormous trade deficit. And we already have significant results in the few 6 months that we've been here. We've made deals with trading partners that cover 40% of our trade. And these are not deals in the traditional sense where we eliminate all our tariffs on both sides. We flipped the script. So we have imposed, other countries have accepted that we are going to have higher tariffs on them, somewhere 10, 15, 20%, and that they have to lower their tariffs for us. So we flipped the script entirely to reduce imports coming into the US and maximize the opportunity for exports going out. We made history at the Turnberry Resort in Scotland, where the EU, one of the great high priests of the so-called international order and trade, accepted the fact that the imbalance is an issue, it has to be resolved, and they agree with us going forward that we can have this kind of change in the terms of trade that will reset the balance. And so we're working as quickly as we can to bring balance to our economy. Now, by taking action so quickly and so strongly in his second term, President Trump is in fact building a production economy, and it will support the fundamentals of a conservative society. This is the kind of society that it cares about the elderly, it cares about the sick, it supports our communities, it's a society that values an individual, their relationship with their God, and all of this. Our job is to make a conservative society possible, so we have to make sure the economic underpinnings will support that. And all of this is common sense. I'm not going to go on about Greek philosophers and thought experiments about how all this is going to work. It's just common sense. So I would just ask you to join our project, right? If you have questions about any of this, if you think George W. Bush's little speech I gave you at the beginning made sense, come just have a personal situation with me, and we'll talk about it, and I'll walk you through it. But I want you to join our project. I want to have the kind of production economy where we can take our country back. We want to buy American cars. We want to buy American computer chips. We want to buy American clothes. People say, oh, we can't have textiles in America again. We can. We have. We had 18 textile mills closed last year. Okay? Those are things that should be open again. Invest your money in American industry. And if you're bold enough, go start the industry yourself. Americans didn't elect anyone in Geneva, Brussels, or Beijing to tax our firms or to regulate our economy. Americans, we elect our own leaders, whether it's in the White House or Congress or state capitals, so we can make decisions for ourselves. We have autonomy, we have sovereignty, and that's the work of a free and independent people. It's the work I support as U.S. Trade Representative, and it's the work that I believe will set our country right. Thank you very much.